She wasn't hard to spot. Miriam noticed her the moment she came through the emergency doors. A woman in her mid-40s, dark coat, sitting forward in her chair, the way people do when they're trying not to fall apart. She had her phone in both hands. She wasn't looking at it. Miriam crossed to the nurse's desk. She gave her name, said she was there for her husband, Gerald Voss. The nurse glanced toward the waiting area, then back at Miriam. That glance, that was the first thing. Slowly, like she wasn't sure of her footing. She told the nurse she was also there for Gerald Voss, that he was her partner. The two women looked at each other. Miriam had been married to Gerald for 23 years. They'd built their life in Stony Creek, Hamilton, a house they'd renovated themselves, a marriage their friends called steady and quiet and lucky. He called every evening when he traveled, every single evening without fail. That was the kind of man she thought she'd married. The waiting room was not quiet. Somewhere behind them, a child was crying. Somewhere overhead, an announcement crackled and cut out. But between these two women, standing 3 feet apart under the fluorescent lights, there was nothing. No words. Not yet. The woman's name, Miriam would learn, was Colette. And Colette had known Gerald for 11 years. Miriam asked her to sit down. She didn't know why she did that first. It was just what came out. Calm, measured, the voice she used with patience when the news wasn't good. She sat down too. She kept her bag on her lap. She kept her hands still. There's a particular kind of composure that isn't really composure at all. It's the thing that takes over when the mind hasn't caught up yet, when the body just keeps going, keeps functioning. Because stopping feels more dangerous than moving forward. That's where Miriam was. She looked at Colette. Really looked. The woman wasn't performing anything. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't apologetic. She was simply there, frightened and present, and clearly as blindsided as Miriam was. She watched Colette's hands on the strap of her bag, knuckles pale, gripped tight. Not the hands of someone who had come here to cause damage. Something settled in Miriam's chest then, something cold and very quiet. She told herself there was an explanation she hadn't reached yet, that this was a misunderstanding with a shape she couldn't see clearly from where she was sitting, that the next few minutes would sort it. She almost believed that. She asked Colette one question. How long had she known Gerald? Colette didn't hesitate. 11 years, she said, since a work event in Hamilton. He'd asked for her number in the car park. Miriam nodded slowly. Like that made sense. Like any of this made sense. It didn't. But she kept nodding anyway. To understand what was sitting in that waiting room with Miriam, you need to understand what 23 years actually looked like. They'd met in their late 20s, both of them starting out, both of them still becoming who they were going to be. Gerald was an architect then, junior, ambitious, always with a pencil tucked behind his ear. Miriam was finishing her physiotherapy training. They got married on a Saturday in October and moved into a small house in Stony Creek that needed everything. They did it themselves. 3 summers of weekends stripping wallpaper, sanding floors, arguing about paint colors in hardware store aisles. Gerald built the bookshelves in the front room by hand. They're still there. It was a good marriage, not a perfect one. No marriages, but a good one. The kind where you still reach for each other in the dark, where you know the other person's coffee order and their worst fear and the exact sound they make when something's really funny. When Miriam's mother died, Gerald didn't know what to say. He never did with grief. But he showed up. He drove her to appointments. He sat beside her at the funeral without once checking his phone. He made sure she ate. She had built her entire sense of home around this man. And that was the thing about betrayals like this one. They don't just take the present. They reach back. They take everything you thought was solid, everything you thought was real. The marriage had never once felt fragile. That was the part that would undo her. The mind does something strange in moments like that one. While Colette sat across from her in the waiting room, moved and hummed around them, Miriam's memory started pulling things up. Old things, small things she hadn't thought about in years. There was a weekend, about 2 years ago, maybe a little more. Gerald had flown back from a conference in Halifax and come home quieter than usual, not cold. Gerald was never cold, just somewhere else. Like a part of him had stayed behind. She'd noticed. Of course she'd noticed. They'd been married long enough that she could read the difference between tired and distant. She asked him once. Just once, over dinner, the night he got back. She said he seemed far away. He said he was exhausted. A late flight, a long week, too many dinners with people he didn't particularly like. She believed him. She cleared the plates and didn't push. That was the thing she kept returning to, sitting in that hospital waiting room. Not the lie itself, but the moment she'd chosen, without even knowing it was a choice, to accept the explanation and move on. She hadn't pushed because she trusted him. She hadn't pushed because trust was the whole foundation. She hadn't pushed because in 23 years, Gerald had never once given her a reason to. Or so she thought. She looked at Colette now and wondered how many of those quiet Sunday evenings had a Halifax attached to them. How many times she'd cleared the plates and left the question on the table. Colette spoke carefully, like she was aware of every word before she placed it down. She told Miriam what Gerald had told her, that his wife's name was Miriam, that she'd been diagnosed with ovarian cancer 8 years into their marriage, that she'd fought it for 2 years and lost, that Gerald had buried her on a gray Tuesday in October and hadn't been the same since. Miriam listened to the story of her own death. She sat with that for a moment, the particular strangeness of hearing yourself described as gone, as grieved, as a before and after in someone else's life. Gerald had built a whole architecture of loss around her name, and Colette, warm, careful Colette, had loved him through it. Then something else surfaced, a different kind of cold. Miriam thought about the times she'd felt uneasy, not often, but they were there if she looked. Small moments of instinct she hadn't known what to do with. A name she didn't recognize, mentioned once and never again. A weekend he came home and showered before he'd even said hello. She brought it up once, gently, the way you do when you don't want to be that person, the suspicious one, the one who checks. He hadn't argued. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply looked at her with something close to concern and said she'd been through so much with her mother. That grief did things to a person's sense of safety, that it was completely understandable she sometimes felt unsettled. She had thanked him for understanding. She had apologized for bringing it up. He could see it now, how precisely it had worked. Not cruel, not dramatic, just quiet, steady, and completely effective. He'd handed her an explanation that fit, and she'd taken it with both hands. Colette started filling in the timeline, not aggressively, not to cause damage. She spoke the way someone does when they've been carrying something alone for a long time, and the weight has finally become unbearable. City by city, year by year. Ottawa, 2015. Gerald had told Miriam it was a 3-day planning conference. Vancouver, 2017. A project site visit. Back Thursday. A long weekend in Niagara-on-the-Lake that Miriam hadn't thought twice about. Each one landed quietly. Each one had a face now. Miriam recognized the gaps. That was the part that hollowed her out. Not that the trips had existed, but that she'd accepted every single one without question. Because why would she question them? Because he always called, every evening, without fail, even from Ottawa, even from Vancouver. She thought about that now, the calls, his voice, warm and familiar, telling her about his day, asking about hers, and all the while, She stopped that thought before it finished. Colette paused. Then she mentioned one more thing. Last spring, Gerald had brought her to a firm dinner in Hamilton, introduced her to colleagues. She'd worn a green dress. It had felt like a step forward, like something real being acknowledged. Miriam's firm dinner. April. She'd been away that week. A physiotherapy conference in Toronto. 4 days already booked. Gerald had dropped her at the station himself, kissed her on the platform. And that same evening, he brought another woman to a dinner in their city. A dinner with people who knew them both. Miriam didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she asked Colette if anyone at that dinner had asked about her, about his wife. Colette's expression answered before she did. There's a question that arrives in moments like this one. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for permission. It just settles in, quiet, persistent, and far more painful than the betrayal itself. Did I choose not to see? Miriam sat with that. Really sat with it. She thought about the woman she'd been inside this marriage. The one who smoothed over silences because she believed that was what love required. The one who accepted the long trips and the late calls and the occasional distance because she trusted the foundation, because she'd built her life on it. She'd been proud of that once, the way she didn't push, the way she gave him room. She'd thought of it as maturity, the kind that takes years to grow into. Now she turned it over in her hands and looked at the other side of it. Had she been trusting? Or had she been convenient? Had she been secure in the marriage? Or had she simply made it very easy to deceive her? She didn't know. That was the honest answer. She genuinely didn't know where trust ended and willful blindness began. And the not knowing was its own kind of vertigo. She thought about the instincts she'd silenced, the questions she'd swallowed, the times her gut had said something, and she'd chosen his explanation over her own reading of things. She'd handed him that too. She wasn't angry at herself. Not yet. It was too early for anger. Right now, it just felt like standing in a room she thought she knew and realizing every wall was in a different place. She looked at Colette. Still there. Still waiting. The room hummed around them both. The nurse appeared at the edge of the waiting area. She was young, early 20s, tired eyes, the particular patience of someone who delivered difficult news on a regular basis. She was carrying a small gray tray. Gerald's personal belongings, she said. Standard procedure while he was in surgery. She set it down on the low table between the two chairs. His watch, silver, scratched on the left side. Miriam had bought it for his 50th birthday. His keys. The bottle opener key ring their son had given him years ago, still on there. His phone. Screen cracked at the corner from a drop he'd never bothered to fix. And his wallet. Brown leather, worn at the fold, edges soft from years of handling. The nurse said someone would be out shortly with an update. Then she left. The tray sat between them. Miriam looked at the wallet. Colette looked at the wallet. Neither of them reached for it. There was something almost unbearable about that moment. Two women who had loved the same man, sitting either side of his belongings, neither one willing to claim them. The watch, the keys, the cracked phone, all the small physical evidence of a life. His life. The one Miriam thought she knew the shape of. She didn't touch anything. Not yet, because once she did, once she picked up that wallet and opened it, whatever was inside would be real. And right now, in this particular breath, it still wasn't. She looked at Colette. Colette looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. It was Colette who broke the silence. She said she had photographs, years of them on her phone, holidays, dinners, ordinary Sundays. She wasn't offering them as evidence. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just said, quietly, almost to herself, that she had them if Miriam wanted to see. Miriam didn't answer straight away. She was deciding something, not about the photographs, about herself, about how much she actually wanted to know. There's a version of this moment where you stand up, collect his belongings, and walk out, where you decide the full picture is more than you need right now, where you protect yourself. Miriam had always been someone who needed to understand things completely. It was why she was good at her job. You couldn't treat what you couldn't see clearly. She asked Colette one question. How long, she said. How long had it actually been? Colette told her. 11 years, since a work event in Hamilton on a Thursday evening in November. Gerald had walked her to her car, asked for her number in the car park under the yellow lights. 11 years. Miriam did the arithmetic without meaning to. 11 years ago, she and Gerald had just finished the last of the renovations. The bookshelves were new. They'd had people over to celebrate. Neighbors, colleagues, friends. Gerald had stood in the front room with a glass of wine in his hand at the small of her back. 3 weeks later, apparently, he'd asked another woman for her number. She looked at the wallet on the tray. She reached out, and she picked it up. The wallet was almost empty. A bank card, his driver's license, a folded receipt she didn't look at, a loyalty card for a coffee place near his office, 7 stamps out of 10. That was it. For one brief moment, one strange, almost embarrassing moment, Miriam felt something loosen in her chest, like maybe the wallet was just a wallet, like maybe there was nothing here, like maybe the next few minutes could still go a different way. She almost put it back down. Then she felt the ridge behind the card slot, a slight thickness, something tucked flat against the back panel, behind everything else. She worked it free with 2 fingers, 2 photographs, small, the kind you print at a pharmacy kiosk. That particular slightly glossy finish, edges just slightly soft. She looked at the first one. It was her, taken years ago. She recognized the kitchen, the old curtains they replaced in 2018. She was laughing at something off camera. She hadn't known the photo was being taken. She looked at the second one, a woman she didn't recognize, smiling, outdoors somewhere. Trees behind her, autumn light, relaxed, happy, the kind of photograph you take of someone when you love them and they don't know you're looking. Miriam looked up at Colette. Colette's eyes were already filling. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. He'd carried them both, side by side, in the same wallet, for she didn't know how long. Years, by the look of the edges. The corners worn completely soft. The doctor appeared then. Stable, he said. Surgery went well. Gerald would be moved to recovery within the hour. Miriam nodded. She thanked him. She looked back down at the 2 photographs in her hand. Stable. That word had meant something different. 20 minutes ago, Colette was quiet for a long time after the doctor left. Then she said there was something else Miriam should know. Something she hadn't mentioned yet, because she hadn't known how. Miriam set the photographs down on the tray. She looked at her. She waited. Colette told her about Christmas, 2 years ago. Gerald had taken her to his sister's house in Ancaster for Christmas dinner. Patricia, Gerald's sister, 3 years younger. The one Miriam had spent every Christmas with for over 2 decades. Patricia had welcomed Colette at the door with both arms, had sat her at the table, had poured her wine and asked about her work and laughed at her stories. And at some point during the evening, Patricia had taken Colette's hand and told her she was so glad Gerald had found someone, that he'd been so lost after Miriam, that it had been hard to watch, that she deserved to be happy too. Miriam heard that and went very still. Patricia knew, not about the affair, about the lie. Gerald had told his own sister that Miriam was dead, had sat across from her at Christmas dinner and let her grieve. A woman who was at home in Stony Creek, 40 minutes away, probably watching television. This wasn't a secret kept in the dark corners of a double life. This had roots, structure, people who had been recruited into it without knowing they were being used. The betrayal wasn't just deeper than Miriam had imagined. It was a different thing entirely. She thought about Patricia, the birthday calls, The Christmas Eve texts, all of it continuing, warm, normal, completely unaware, while Gerald built an architecture of Miriam's death around her name. Colette said there was one more thing. She said Gerald had told her 6 months ago that he was thinking of proposing. Miriam turned that word over slowly, like it was in a language she almost spoke. He was going to ask Colette to marry him, while he was already married to a woman he had told the world was dead. A woman who was very much alive and sitting 40 minutes away in Stony Creek, in the house with the bookshelves he built with his own hands. She looked down at the 2 photographs still on the tray. Her own face looked back at her, laughing, unaware. Taken in a kitchen she still cooked in every morning. She thought about the wallet, how worn the edges were, how soft the corners had gone. You don't carry a photograph for 11 years by accident. You make a choice every single day to keep it there. Every morning when you reach for your cards, every time you pay for something, every time someone asks for ID. 11 years of choosing. She thought for a moment that the photographs meant something. That being carried, even alongside someone else, meant she was still real to him. Still present. Still something. But that wasn't it at all. She understood now what the photographs actually were. They weren't love. They weren't guilt. They were just Gerald, a man so unwilling to let go of anything that he carried both women in his wallet, like they were his to keep, like they were things that belonged to him, rather than people who had trusted him completely. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't cry. She went very still. The particular stillness of a person who has just understood something they can't ununderstand. The 2 photographs sat on the gray tray between them. Neither woman touched them again. Miriam excused herself. She said she needed a moment. Colette nodded. She understood, or at least she had the grace to act like she did. Miriam walked out of the waiting room and into the corridor, the long fluorescent kind that smells like cleaning fluid and recycled air. She walked until the waiting room was out of sight. Then she stopped. She stood under the lights and tried to locate herself. Not physically. She knew where she was. She was in a hospital corridor in Hamilton on a Wednesday evening in November, wearing her good coat because she'd come straight from work. She knew all of that. What she couldn't locate was the version of herself that had existed this morning. The woman who'd packed Gerald's overnight bag once the ambulance came. Who turned off the stove and locked the front door and driven here thinking about nothing except getting to him. That woman had known exactly who she was and exactly what her life looked like. She was gone now, or at least she was going to have to be rebuilt. Miriam thought about the last 23 years, not the betrayal, not the lie, just the ordinary days inside them. The Tuesday evenings and the grocery runs and the arguments about nothing and the moments of real, uncomplicated warmth. Were those real? Had any of it been real? She didn't know. That was the part that frightened her most. Not the anger, not the grief, but the not knowing. The way the whole history of the marriage had become a question she couldn't answer anymore. She'd built herself, in part, around being loved by this man. And now she was standing in a corridor in Hamilton, trying to work out who she was without that. She stood there for a long time. Then she straightened her coat, and she walked back. Colette was still there when Miriam returned. She hadn't moved. She was sitting with her hands in her lap now. The bag sat down beside her feet, and she looked like someone who had been holding themselves together for so long that the effort had simply run out. Miriam sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. She told her, quietly, without any bitterness. She could hear in her own voice that none of this was Colette's fault, that she hadn't known, that the lie had been Gerald's entirely from the first word of it, that Colette had loved someone she believed was real, and that was not something to be ashamed of. Colette's face crumpled. She didn't make much sound. Just the particular kind of crying that happens when something you thought was your whole future dissolves in a single evening. Her shoulders came forward, her hands covered her face, and Miriam, the woman who had come to this hospital as the wife, the wronged one, the one this had happened to, put her hand on Colette's back. She hadn't planned to. It just happened, the way certain instincts do, when you've spent enough of your life taking care of people. That was the unexpected thing about that evening. Not the photographs, not the lie about her death, not even Patricia at Christmas dinner. It was this. That, in the end, Miriam was the one holding the room together, while Gerald lay in a recovery ward 1 floor above them. Stable, the doctor had said. Both women he had kept sat side by side in the waiting room below. Neither of them went up to see him, not that night. Miriam drove home alone. The highway back to Stony Creek was quiet at that hour, just headlights and dark, and the particular emptiness of late-night Ontario in November. She didn't turn the radio on. She didn't call anyone. She just drove. She thought about what she was going back to. The house, the front room with the bookshelves, the kitchen where her own photograph had been taken without her knowing, on some ordinary afternoon that had meant nothing at the time, and now meant something she didn't have a word for yet. She pulled into the driveway and turned the engine off. She sat there for a long time, long enough that the car went cold, long enough that the neighbors' lights went off one by one, long enough to let the evening settle into something she could almost hold. She thought about the photograph in that wallet. Her own face, worn at the edges, carried for 11 years alongside a woman she'd never met, in a life she'd never been allowed to see. She thought about what it meant to be kept like that, not loved, not chosen. Just kept. She decided she didn't want to be kept anymore. She went inside. She didn't turn on many lights. She moved through the house the way you do when you're seeing it differently. The same rooms, the same furniture, but the dimensions slightly changed. In the kitchen, she picked up the framed photograph from the windowsill. Their wedding day. Gerald in his gray suit, her in the dress her mother had helped her choose, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it face down on the counter. She went to bed. She didn't sleep, not really, but she lay there in the quiet of the house in Stony Creek, and she breathed, in and out, in and out. Tomorrow there would be lawyers and phone calls and conversations she wasn't ready for. Tomorrow there would be Patricia, and Gerald's room at the hospital, and a marriage that needed to be formally and finally undone. But tonight she was just a woman lying in the dark, learning the shape of her own life without someone else in the middle of it. She'd carried him for 23 years. She set him down, and for the first time in a long time, the weight was gone.